Ladies and gentlemen, I am Nancy Cronin, Vice President of the City Club, substituting for our President, Nelson Weiss, who is away today. Our speaker today is Randall Robinson from Washington, D.C., where he is the Executive Director of TransAfrica, the Black American lobby for Africa and the Caribbean. Mr. Robinson is an attorney, a graduate of Virginia Union University and Harvard Law School. He has served as staff assistant to Congressman William Clay and as administrative assistant to Congressman Charles Diggs, Jr. As staff attorney, he has worked with the Compensatory Education Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law in Washington, D.C., and with the Boston Legal Assistance Project in Roxbury, Massachusetts. As a Ford Foundation Fellow, Mr. Robinson researched in Tanzania the Africanization of European law and its social impact. He is the author of several articles, most recently a report of his meeting in March with President Fidel Castro of Cuba. Today, Mr. Robinson will speak on U.S. policy toward Africa. Please welcome Randall Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you. I am extremely pleased to be in Cleveland today. I was not aware of how pleased I was or am now until we landed in heavy winds at the airport. I am simply pleased to be today. But this is a great opportunity and a chance for us to have exchanges on issues that are dear to me and so important to the world. It is particularly important that I have an opportunity to speak before such a large and influential Midwestern audience, because it is so important that we cultivate in the heartland of America an appreciation and a sensitivity towards the problems, the thrust, the feelings, the drives, the interests, the objectives of those countries that make up the Third World, and understand better what U.S. policy ought to be towards those countries. Never has the need in the world been greater than it is today for a statesmanlike and constructive leadership from the United States. But never has the United States been less likely or less able to give it. The stakes are high, the risks are great, not only for the United States and its relations towards Africa, but for the very future of the world. Few Americans are aware of the peril. We are a sadly parochial country. A member of Congress recently, in a position to know, told me he didn't think that there were more than 20 members of Congress who could name 3 African countries. Perhaps he exaggerated. The likelihood is that he did not. The question is, how can we afford, as a nation, to know so little about a continent on which this nation grows progressively dependent? In the last 20 years, the significance of Africa has increased dramatically in the economic and strategic calculus of the American foreign policy making apparatus. 38% of U.S. oil comes from Africa. Much of the balance of the oil we import from the Middle East travels sea lanes that Africa sits astride. Growth in U.S.-Africa trade and investment continues impressively, with badly needed benefits for a sagging U.S. economy. From 1970 to 1976, U.S. exports to Africa tripled in value. And it is projected that exports to Africa will increase 10% annually by 1987, creating in the process some 780,000 additional jobs in the United States. Added to this is an increasing United States dependence on Africa for supplies of minerals vital to our economy and defense. Yet, given its doubtless importance, Africa has traditionally been seen by U.S. policymakers through the fogged lens of Soviet designs on penetration. On issues ranging from South Africa's racial policy to the war in Eritrea, never has the United States focused primarily on understanding the often single-minded course of African political, economic, and social development and framed our responses accordingly. As a consequence of this short-sightedness, opportunities too often have been lost, policy reverses too often suffered, and potential friends squandered because of our nation's inability to appreciate legitimate African central objectives and the intensity with which those objectives are embraced by broad African constituencies. African nations have set for themselves two major objectives: economic development of the independent African countries and the final, total, and complete liberation of South Africa and Namibia. Any serious American effort to facilitate the achievement or to cultivate relations with Africa must facilitate the achievement of these two objectives. And so I think the question for us today is, how has the Reagan administration fared in this regard? I'm sad to report, not well at all. Perhaps the most widely reaching problem besetting the world's people today is the problem of intractable poverty. Because of poverty, the hungry populations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America will double not long after the turn of a century. Because of poverty, a world that does not adequately support 4 billion people today, 100 years from today, will have to support 40 billion people. The United Nations Children's Fund estimates that since 1978, 30 million children under the age of 5 in the world have starved to death each year. And of the world's 4 billion people, experts suggest that as many as 1 billion are victimized by hunger and grinding poverty. The Reagan administration has indicated that its priority in relating to the Third World is to look after the strategic interest of the United States. One hopes that the administration can be persuaded to take a broader view of the challenge before it. For if this nation is to prosper in its political and economic relations with the majority of the world's peoples, it must do so in a world at peace. If history teaches us anything, it instructs us unmistakably that there can be no lasting peace or stability where there is hunger and grinding poverty. Since the end of World War II, over 200 wars and rebellions have been waged in 70 countries, costing over 25 million lives. The overwhelming majority occurred in and between poor nations of the world. During the 1970s, 16 wars were fought between states by professional armies. All but 2 involved third world countries on both sides. 9 of the 16 were fought on the world's poorest continent, Africa. While it may not be reduced to so easy an analysis, one can no longer dispute the causal connection between poverty and societal instability. Thus, it behooves us as a nation to respond to the economic problems of the Third World, not so much out of a spirit of charity as out of an enlightened concern about the future of the world. Foreign economic assistance can no longer be successfully presented to the American taxpayer as a dole. It must more accurately be described and promoted as an investment in the future of that part of the world on which America grows progressively dependent for raw materials, trade, domestic job creation, and strategic security. 2 courses of action appear open to us as a nation. We can continue with meager overall economic assistance while arming to the teeth pro-American third world regimes, or we can better ensure our long-term interest by curbing our military support inclinations, substantially increasing economic assistance, and negotiating in good faith with the developing world towards the establishment of a more equitable international economic order. The former course on which we now find ourselves has yielded few gains. The world is in all likelihood more unstable than ever, with annual military expenditures now in excess of $450 billion a year, while official development assistance from aid-giving countries accounts for less than 5% of that figure. To further dramatize this imbalance, Willy Brandt, former Chancellor of West Germany, wrote as chairman of the Independent Commission on International Development Issues, and I quote, "1/2% of 1 year's military expenditure would pay for all the farm equipment needed to increase food production and approach self-sufficiency in food deficit low-income countries by 1990. It is a terrible irony that the most dynamic and rapid transfer of highly sophisticated equipment and technology from the rich to the poor has been in the machinery of death," unquote. Nowhere in the world is a different and more economic or more effective U.S. development assistance approach more needed than in Africa. Africa, rich in potential, and at the same time the home of 21 of the world's 31 poorest countries, continues to fall economically further and further behind the developed world. Per capita food production continues its decline as persistent deforestation contributes to the problem. Escalating cost of imported oil, foodstuffs, and manufactured goods have exhausted foreign reserves and further deepened the existent balance of payments problem. Already burdened with the highest urbanization growth rates in the world, at the current pace of general expansion, Africa's overall population will double in 30 years. Infrastructures for food production, storage and transport, health care delivery, communication, energy production, and the like remain vastly inadequate. Still suffering from colonial memories and neo-colonial realities of economic abuse, Africa accounts for less than 1% of the world's industrial production. All of these factors have combined to produce economic and political instability, in some cases repression, and then lastly, about half of the world's refugees. The United States, if it is to cultivate a genuine and enduring friendship with Africa generally, must cooperate in sizable and thoughtful good faith efforts to find solutions to these problems. Regrettably, the Reagan administration has not led us in that direction. The outlays have been too small. The United States, 15th on a list of 17 aid-giving industrialized nations, contributes only 6% of Africa's bilateral assistance. We cannot hope as a nation to make a significant impact at those aid levels. Despite the facts that U.S. economic well-being and security are increasingly related to the development of Africa, the real value of U.S. economic assistance to Africa is declining. Although dollar amounts of aid to Africa have risen over the last decade, since 1980, when adjusted for inflation, the aid has fallen. Further, the largest increases have been in the area of Africa's smallest need, military assistance. U.S. aid to Somalia is perhaps the best example of how development ends are badly misserved by military assistance. For 20 years, Somalia has either waged or supported an irredentist insurgency in the Ogaden province of Ethiopia at a cost that has brought Somalia to economic ruin and saddled it with the world's largest refugee population of 1.5 million people. American military support for Somalia serves only to encourage Somalia's continued conduct of a war for which it enjoys no African support, worsens its economic and refugee burdens, and increases threatened Ethiopia's dependence on Cuba and the Soviet Union for military support. One may further interpret from Reagan administration statements, and even more readily from Reagan administration actions, an unconstructive tendency to favor our friends and punish our enemies. Benin, a tiny country in West Africa, which has never received more than $4.7 billion in U.S. economic assistance, has been virtually cut off from further assistance. This has happened, I'm informed, because Benin has been critical of the United States in international fora. Of course, Benin's socialist orientation no doubt provides an added incentive for American punishment. This is unfortunate and counterproductive. For as long as the United States perceives African nations not as genuine potential friends, but as pawns of the East-West conflict, we cannot hope to respond effectively to the knotty problems of development. For these nations, the choice is not so much between capitalism and communism. It is a matter of searching for workable economic development methodologies. Towards such commonly appreciated development ends as food production, training, health care delivery, and infrastructure development, every African country has sought constructive relations with the United States. It is neither in our interest nor theirs to turn our backs on any country seeking our friendship. Let us turn now to that explosive set of political issues concerning Southern Africa. No issue galvanizes African opinion as does the fundamental affront of South Africa to the entire continent of Africa, indeed to the entire world. South Africa is the only country in the world where the right to vote is exclusively reserved for one race. Black South Africans may not own land, move within their own country without passes, or enjoy other social and political rights ordinarily associated with citizenship. Indeed, South Africa's program of separate development denies and deprives blacks of their fundamental right to citizenship. Let us not be deceived. There are no peaceful avenues to change within South Africa. Political opposition by whites and blacks alike is met with arbitrary arrest, prolonged detention without charge, banning orders, torture, and often death. Under the International Security Act of 1976, the Terrorism Act, the Riotous Assemblies Act, and the Unlawful Organization Act, the South African police state has unlimited capacity to control and destroy dissent by blacks and whites alike. Since 1942, some 50 African countries have achieved independence and self-determination. Only 2 remain to be freed from the bondage of a modern slavery: South Africa and the nation that it has illegally occupied for the last 15 years, Namibia. Since apartheid was installed as an official government policy in 1948, the Pretoria regime has spared nothing in its commitment to the tyranny of white minority rule at home and in Namibia, a tyranny designed to be buffered and protected in perpetuity by neighboring states reduced to dependency by constant South African military attacks. Since Ronald Reagan came to power 2 years ago, South Africa has increased its military budget by 30%, invaded Mozambique, unleashed assassination squads against Zimbabwe, undermined Lesotho, increased its troop levels in Namibia, and maintained a virtual occupation of southern Angola. It is not a coincidence, my friends, that this latest chapter of increased regional aggression on the part of South Africa corresponds almost precisely with the period of the Reagan presidency. South Africa was overjoyed with the election of Ronald Reagan. Their confidence was not misplaced. During 2 years of recalcitrance on Namibia, rightward movement inside South Africa, and increased regional belligerence, the Reagan administration has not so much as lightly scolded its new ally. Inheriting a framework of Western diplomacy aimed at bringing about United Nations supervised elections in Namibia, the Reagan administration said from the beginning that the Carter administration had failed with South Africa because it had been too critical of Pretoria. The charge was that President Carter gave too much stick and not enough carrots. In exchange for cooperation on Namibia, the new administration promised to confer upon South Africa international respectability. Indeed, my friends, we have conferred much more than that. Most recently, we have sent them 2,500 shock batons. We have supported in the International Monetary Fund South Africa's application for the largest loan Pretoria has ever received from any source, $1.1 billion. In the United Nations, we have opposed criticism of South Africa. Bilaterally, we have encouraged official visits to the United States, expanded attaché contact, extended Coast Guard training, and generally created an atmosphere of legitimacy for the world's only model of constitutionalized racism. How has the Reagan hand of friendship been rewarded? What has South Africa given back? What constructive impact have the carrots had? The carrots have been eaten whole and totally. More have been requested. But never once has South Africa seriously hinted at moderating its policy on Namibia, apartheid at home, or in the region in general. Over the past 6 months, I have talked directly with President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, Sam Nujoma, leader of the Southwest Africa People's Organization, Paulo Jorge, Foreign Minister of Angola, and Fidel Castro, President of Cuba. Scores of other Africans and international observers. None believes that South Africa will agree to any plan that would bring self-determination to Namibia under United Nations supervision. For all intents and purposes, the Western diplomacy leading towards that is dead. Why then, one must ask oneself, do spokesmen from the Reagan administration alone express such great optimism about the progress of these talks? Certainly it cannot wholly be explained away as the misjudgment of the naive. For under the cover of these long-term failed negotiations, the Reagan administration has formed a major, warm, de facto alliance with the world's most despicable regime. I think we ought to understand something here about how nations act and conduct business. Nations do not change course without calculating it to be in their interest to do so. Why should South Africa become less destructive and repressive so long as our nation rewards destruction and repression? Until we raise the cost of South Africa's occupation of Namibia through Western application of economic and diplomatic pressure, we cannot hope to change Pretoria's course of action. In the last analysis, let us understand here what is at stake for America. Let us understand what kind of future relations America will need to have with the whole of developing Africa. Though it may never be broadly understood across this country, the African question to us is simple. They ask, will America stand with Africa for equitable democracy and simple justice in South Africa and Namibia? Or will America stand with white South Africa in a futile attempt to slam shut the gates of freedom? Let us not delude ourselves, my friend. This issue, this question, is of the highest importance to Africa. It would be foolish to eclipse it with preoccupations about Soviet penetration, Cuban troops, and the like. Africa wants to know whether we are with them or against them. Worry less about our susceptibility to communism, they tell us. Worry more about our quest for those universal benefits of freedom so many of us through history have fought and died for. The Reagan administration has had an opportunity to begin answering Africa's question. Sadly, that response will go far to shape the future of U.S.-Africa relations. The Namibia diplomacy has failed because South Africa fears that democratic elections conducted under the United Nations observation would bring the Southwest Africa People's Organization to power. Over the last 5 years, SWAPO has made every conceivable concession in an attempt to end a long and bloody war and to get on with the implementations of the UN Security Council's plan for the independence of that territory. No one can dispute that South Africa alone has stalled this carefully crafted process. No one can dispute either that South Africa expects the United States to sustain their intransigence. Africa asks of us, are you with us or against us? No dissembling, please. I challenge our government today to answer that question. Will the United States commit itself to use every available resource, every imaginable pressure, every workable sanction to bring Pretoria to heel on the question of Namibia? The United States does not recognize Angola. Virtually every African government has diplomatic relations with Angola. Most of them have encouraged our government to follow suit. Great Britain, West Germany, France, Canada have all established embassies in Luanda. Though American businesses are there and thriving, our nation remains alone in the West in the withholding of recognition. We are told that the United States does not recognize Angola because there are Cuban troops there. The reasoning here is tortured. Soviet troops are in East Germany, and we recognize East Germany. And we're even led to believe that there's Soviet troops in the Soviet Union, and we recognize the Soviet Union. How can we recognize the sovereign blight of South Africa and withhold it from an Angola being invaded and occupied by South Africa? 2 years ago, in testimony before the House Subcommittee on Africa, Professor Gerald Bender asked, can any member of our government guarantee this subcommittee, or the Angolans for that matter, that if the Cubans were to be withdrawn, South Africa would not greatly increase its attacks against Angola in an attempt to bring down that government? Africa asks of us again the same question on this burning issue of South Africa. Are you with us or against us? There is growing support in America for those in South Africa who have struggled so long for freedom. A national poll conducted by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace on March 16, 1979, found Americans to believe that the United States should do something to get South Africa to change its system, with a plurality favoring a range of activities, including trade restrictions. Surely change is inevitable. The very logic and sweep of African history places certain matters beyond dispute. That black South Africans will settle for nothing less than one person, one vote in a unitary state, and that this objective will be achieved in 20 years with or without American support. I urge the Reagan administration, for the good of America, for the good of Africa, and for the good of the world, to listen closely to African voices that tell us where Africa will and must go. For those who counsel that Angola will fall are wrong. Angola will neither fall nor be compromised. And those who counsel that South Africa can hold out in Namibia and at home are wrong. Namibia will achieve an unqualified independence in the near future, and South Africa will be transformed in my lifetime. Listen to African voices that tell us where Africa will and must go, for they simply ask of America, are you with us or against us? I urge the Reagan administration to give a new and different answer, for it is the only basis for any American future friendship with the continent of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Today at the City Club, we are listening to Randall Robinson, Director of TransAfrica, addressing us on United States foreign policy towards Africa. In just a moment, we'll turn to our question period, but first we have some announcements. As you may know by now, we shall be moving very soon to the Citizens Building in our new City Club quarters. This is a very exciting time for us here at the club, and it's a good time for those of you who may not now be members to consider joining our official family. Our membership is open, we are non-exclusive, and we invite you to join us. Call us at 621-0082 for more information. We need your support. We'd like you to be here next week and the next week and the next week. Today, as always, we have students with us who are participating in the Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Public Schools and Cuyahoga Community College. Students are here from the following high schools today: John Adams, Fairview, Padua, Mid-Park, Garfield Heights, Mayfield, Health Careers Center, and the Cleveland School of Science. Will you students please stand so you can receive a welcome from the City Club? Thank you. These students will be meeting later with Mr. Robinson for their own seminar right here after the forum. Next week, our speaker will be Karen Horn, the recently appointed president of Cleveland's Federal Reserve Bank. Her perspective is our year-long concern with the national economy, and what she has to say about current problems will be of special interest to us all. Be sure that you make your reservations early, perhaps as you're going out the door today, for this very important address. Now for questions from you for Mr. Robinson. We have two microphones, one with Alan Davis right here, one with Frank Ruby right here. Please stand up and signal your interest in asking a question. First question, please, Alan.
Mr. Robinson, do you agree that the media is responsible for a great deal of this distortion? We read with redundancy of Cuban troops in Angola, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, but we never read that there are Cuban medical teams, Cuban literacy teams, and Cubans helping these countries. There's never a word of that in our press.
Sure. Let me say two things about that, one about Cuba and one about the coverage. Cuba is a country of 10 million people, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, small, struggling third world country that has been attacked economically by the United States for the last 20 years. One can say broadly in those 20 years that the lot of the Cuban people in general has improved vastly, particularly for the 30% of that population that is black. By Commerce Department statistics, so that we will know that what I'm saying is entirely authentic and valid, Cubans in the space of 20 years have raised the lifespan from 52 to 72 years and have dropped infant mortality to 18 per thousand, and have eradicated illiteracy. Medical health care for everyone. I don't think anyone can look at that society and suggest that that has not been a more humane response to the needs of those 10 million people than what preceded under Batista. We support Haiti. Tonight in Haiti, 60% of the people in that country will go to bed without a roof over their heads. And we've tried to choke Cuba. And the reason is that one says it is communist and the other says it is capitalist. Americans will have to learn to understand that for most of the third world, the question really is not communism or capitalism. The question is 3 meals a dayism and a place to sleepism. And that any government that can provide people with those basic articles for living will be popular. One thing I do know, that the Castro government is vastly popular in Cuba. Now, the Cubans don't seem to understand why they can't globalize. They don't understand why their troops can't go to Angola if ours can go all over the world. They think somehow that they have as much right to do that as we do. I don't know how they come by that notion, but they want to stick to it. We never mention French troops in Africa. We never mention the use of Moroccan troops as surrogates for American interest. We only mention communist troops because we want to polarize Africa, to make it a mound of dirt over which the East and the West fight. I think that the media has been awful in two respects. I'm often reminded to come back to the awful arrogance of the New York Times masthead, suggesting that it is all of the news that is fit to print. I remember the statistic I gave you about the 30 million children dying every year under the age of 5 of starvation. And we don't know anything about that as a country. But a couple of years ago, Prince Charles fell off a horse. And for those of us who didn't read the paper that day, he fell off again the next week. And this was front page business across the country. Now it's coup stock. We stay in the royal family. But the world is coming apart at its seams, and there's no coverage. My guess is the plain dealer gives, I can count on one hand probably the column inches given to Africa, Latin America, and Asia in the space of a year. So we create in this country a vastly ignorant pool of people from which we draw our policymakers who know nothing about what they're doing or the areas about which they're talking or towards which they're making policy. So that I think that we've been failed by our media. I think we've been tremendously failed by our educational system. I think it's a consequence of the arrogance of number oneism. You all remember who finished ahead of you in high school and college, but you don't remember much about those who were behind you in school. So that those who exercise power seldom focus on the victims and the powerless. They always know more about the powerful than the powerful know about them. Puts the U.S. at a distinct disadvantage because America's dependency increases. And so when the blacks in South Africa finally prevail, as they will soon, they will look around to see who helped them and who hurt them. They have to count the United States in the column opposed to the quest for their freedom. This story is repeated around the world because we want to see every situation in terms of what the Soviets are doing. George McGovern once told me that if the Soviet Union came out against cancer, we would support it. Because sometimes there's an opportunity to look at a country, to look at a struggle, and decide which is the right side to be on without concerning ourselves with which side the Soviet Union is on. And in closing that point, let's think about ourselves. Because we here, just like Africans and Asians and everybody else in the third world, and what we want. You cannot export revolution to people who don't want to have a revolution. So that if the Soviets drop guns on people and tanks and everything else that they need, if their lives were in order, they wouldn't be prepared to fight. So that when anything happens in the world, there's no point in us looking at Moscow. Not where the problem is. But we do it. But the Africans in South Africa, when I was in Cape Town, you ride down the street in Cape Town, you'll know the problem immediately. One, it looks just like San Francisco. And you look up at the billboards and you see General Motors and you see Ford and you see B.F. Goodrich and you see Goodyear and you see all of that, and you know whose product South Africa is. And you know how the Western powers got on that side of the issue. They're supporting a losing horse. And so the Western sphere of influence continues to shrink and shrink and shrink. And policy people here talk about communism and communism and communism. This is not the issue. Our journalists don't help us with that. Yes?
Firstly, I don't, where is it? Oh, I don't get all my information from the newspapers. I've been in Africa, I've been in South Africa, I've been in 7 South African countries. Some of the things you said I can agree with, some of the things I can violently disagree with you. For example, you made the statement that no progress has been made in South Africa since Reagan took over. And incidentally, I'm a Democrat. I disagree with you 100% because I get information out of South Africa all the time, and I think Botha has put his future on the line to try to make some headway in trying to get equal rights for at least 2 minority groups in South Africa, and you know this. You know that the Indians and the Orientals and the Coloreds, he is desperately trying to get some semblance of representation. So I disagree. You say no movement has been made. It has been made. The question is this, that since colonialism...
Can I respond to that?
Well, that wasn't a question. Here's the question. Since colonialism left Africa, the overwhelming majority of the countries that were left behind have dictatorships. And there isn't any of those countries that are ruled by people of their own race, where there hasn't been more killings, more torture, more imprisonments, more denials of equal rights, that is one vote for one person, than the overwhelming amount. How can you stand up there? Now wait a second. Why don't you stand up there and say we should have an equal policy all over Africa, and in all these countries where the black people have been enslaved by their own black people, that we should enforce one man, one vote rule in those countries too? Why don't you stand up for that?
I'm going to stand up for it right now. Let me take both questions. I'm the first one to say that the quest for justice is indivisible. It has nothing to do with race. The issue of South Africa is not a racial issue. It's a struggle between right and wrong. There are whites in South Africa who are dying for this too, because they believe in what they're doing. You are vastly, outrageously wrong to suggest that most African governments have dictatorships simply because they don't have a democracy that is exactly like the one that we have here. I've lived in Tanzania. The Tanzanians have a one-party democracy. I found it very comfortable to live with. Americans seem to suggest that if you don't have more than one party, you don't have the kind of democracy you ought to have. Italy has 50. Is that the kind of democracy that you want? A lot of countries that have been formally colonized, that need to go a long way in a short space of time, need efficient instruments of government. Doesn't mean at all that they don't have democratic systems. People vote in Cuba. Fidel is elected. Their parliament, their lawmaking body is elected. You find that funny. But I would suggest, wait a minute, no, I would suggest that while no democracy is perfect, if we look closely, we'll find this one more vastly imperfect than you think it is, and you will find African democracies more nearly perfect than you are suggesting that they are. Now, on the question of injustice in independent African countries, it exists. It exists in quite a few countries. It exists in any case when colonial rulers leave a few trained people with unchecked power. Anytime, irrespective of race, you put powerful and powerless people together on a class basis, on an ethnic basis, on a race basis, on any basis, the powerful will abuse the powerless. It has happened in countries, yes. But we have found that in Uganda, Obote was not overthrown by the Ugandans. Amin was installed by the Europeans. And so when we charged it to Africa, the Africans say, don't come to us. We didn't put him in. You did. In Congo, in Zaire, Mobutu, out of the words of the American former Assistant Secretary of State, was installed by the CIA. You've got to understand that in many cases in this world, third world governments don't control themselves. Their governments are engineered, paid for, bought, spied on by us. So let's not talk about that kind of freedom. We don't live in a vacuum. And our forces are all over the world. Just finishing your point on South Africa. I wouldn't want that to go away. It wasn't a question.
Mr. Robinson.
What, well, no, I just want to finish his point for just a second on South Africa. You said Botha has made some progress. He has made a proposal that would give some political representation to a tiny minority of coloreds and Indians. No one believes, first of all, that that will pass. No one believes that he will spend a great deal of his political capital on it and will spend even less on Namibia. I don't know who your sources are. I certainly don't make decisions from Washington. I talk to black South Africans. I talk to Buthelezi. I talk to Bishop Tutu. I talk to ANC people. I talk to the very leadership of the black community. I talk to white journalists. I talk to South African embassy officials. And let's make it clear that from the Helen Suzmans, the sort of liberal wing of the South African parliament, on over to the Verkrampte conservatives, on the question of one person, one vote in a unitary state, there is not one vote for it in the white community of the body politic at all. On that question, they are certain. When it comes down to sharing power with 20 million blacks, the answer is a resounding no. Now, you can dress up apartheid and call that progress. But let's not confuse the struggle in South Africa with the civil rights struggle in the United States. Black South Africans are not fighting to ride on buses or to sit in restaurants or for equal opportunity. They are fighting for control. They're fighting for one person, one vote, and after that is done, then we can see who sits where. So that it's a fundamentally different kind of struggle and should not be confused with the struggle here. In its social dynamics, perhaps it is similar. In other ways, it is not. Yes.
Mr. Robinson, I have a three-part question. Number one, what are the possibilities of the third world developing without the help of the United States? Number two, the Reagan alliance with South Africa and with the heavy arms that South Africa has, is this a possibility of white expansionist policies to wrest from the other black African countries its riches without having to pay for them? Thirdly, what kind of consideration do you expect from an administration which has insulted blacks all over the world by putting the Haitians in concentration camps while receiving white refugees from other parts of the world with gusto?
The third question is easy. You know, there's no accident that the Statue of Liberty sits in New York Harbor and faces Europe. We want your huddled masses, but we'd like them to be white. When you look at the refugee figures, half of the world's refugees are in Africa, but less than 3% of those admitted to the United States are black. So that we go on to airliners in New York and beg Soviets to defect. We virtually pull them off planes. But we're dropping Haitians in the drink. And that's because of two reasons. One is that we like our refugees to be from communist countries, and we like them white. If they're from communist countries in Eastern Europe, we spend about $3,000 per refugee. If they're black and from Africa, we spend less than $20 per refugee. And so that you can see sort of permeation of policy with this from World War II on. As the color of the aid recipient got darker, the American aid got smaller. As the color of a refugee got darker, the American door through which you have to come got smaller. So that one doesn't expect much from this administration. But one has to continue to try to raise the profile of this issue for public discussion. I'm trying to remember your first question.
My first question was if the third world, the African countries
could develop without
yes.
U.S. assistance. I think that this is a part of why the U.S. proceeds with such arrogance in the third world, largely because it has a huge technology advantage. The Soviet Union provides liberation groups with arms. The Soviet Union doesn't provide much in economic support. The principal beneficiary of Soviet support is Cuba. And let's be clear, the Soviet Union doesn't want any more Cubas. They're having trouble with their own economy. The Soviets don't participate in the IMF and the World Bank and the international monetary development institutions, so that Western powers have almost complete control. We control 39% of the votes in the IMF, in the Western community. So that it means that the U.S. can have its cake and eat it too. For instance, Angola, when they were fighting against the Portuguese, the largest supply of funds of any company in the U.S. was Gulf oil. So that after the liberation was had, the Angolans looked around for other companies, perhaps a Soviet company that would come and help them. And they couldn't find it. Gulf is still there pumping oil. under the protection of Cuban troops. It's a strange kind of irony. But nonetheless, that the Western powers feel that they can abuse you and you will need them later if you're going to develop, because they have a lock on technology. Now, Africa is interested in developing a technology bank and to do some things independently with appropriate technology and things like that. But it would be overly optimistic for me to say that that wouldn't be terribly difficult without a better response from the Western nations, because technology tends to sort of accumulate geometrically. It is difficult to catch up when you think about us with throwaway technology in toys now in the West. So that so much has been developed in the last 25 years in the West in terms of accumulative technology. It is a little much to ask without any assistance from the West, African and third world countries to catch up. So that while they have to be self-sufficient, at the same time we have to continue to press for a better response from the West. I think we ought to understand too that when we talk about these things again, we shouldn't talk about them in terms of charity. The nuclear club in the world is growing. We got to think about these things, and all you need is a physics book and a little plutonium to produce a first-generation nuclear device now, and one can expect that in the next 50 years, countless countries are going to have nuclear capacity. One doesn't know about delivery systems, but they're going to have the capacity. And many of these countries are just angry as hell because they have felt so abused by the United States. And in closing that point, Americans need to know that because we feel this way about ourselves within this country, people who live outside this country don't necessarily feel the way we feel about ourselves. And we tend to define them as crazies. Whenever somebody's off somewhere shooting and doing these things, we somehow say, my God, when people are mad, they just like to fight. But we ought to think about them like we think about ourselves. Do you want to be shot at or to shoot at someone? Certainly for no reason, so that they have some cause. And it behooves us to try to understand better what motivates people to put their lives at risk for something they feel that they've been denied. Now, I forgot your second question, but I don't think I had an answer to that one anyhow. Yes.
Mr. Robinson, the very decisive victory of the nuclear freeze resolutions in the last election is said to have caused the president to take an entirely new attitude and recognize and we hope do something about the threat of war and nuclear armament. By the same token, the very important influence of the black vote in the last election should or can it be influential in changing this administration's attitude to South Africa and apartheid?
Well, I'm very pleased about the nuclear freeze issue. A member of our board, Harry Belafonte, has been very active on that issue and has traveled all over Europe advancing that cause. Of course, it's a much bigger issue in Europe as a popular issue than it is in the United States. But I think once Americans begin to understand better potential consequences for all of us, we will be more responsive. Coming back to the journalism question again, I think, again, that's a very complicated issue that very, very few people can even begin to understand. Exactly what you need to have weapon systems adequacy and how much we ought to trust our own people in telling us what we think the Soviets have so that we don't put our own society at great risk. One has to fault journalists again for not giving the American people sufficient stuff to create the kind of debate that we ought to have. To date, I think it's been a largely white, middle class, a sort of well-to-do community debate, and it ought to be broadened, and I think we need more public information to do that. On the question of influencing the Reagan administration through the vote, the black community has always found itself in the difficult position of having Democrats know that they cannot win a national election without our support, but they can lose one with it. And they always get it. And so that when the Republicans get into office, we found ourselves this time as the only definable constituency in the country that voted overwhelmingly against Ronald Reagan. And so he has simply given back to us what we gave to him in spades. No pun intended. But that's why our best avenue, of course, on this issue is to marshal our forces and to get blacks registered and get Reagan out of office. And believe me, I expect the black community will vote in much, much greater numbers, even more overwhelmingly against Reagan the second time than the first time, assuming we haven't all been Hooverized by then.
Mr. Robinson, as a worker in the media, I want to get you away from that subject. I wanted to ask, there are many corporations located here in Cleveland, as well as throughout the rest of the country, have operations in South Africa, and they sometimes justify these operations on the grounds that they're adhering to the so-called Sullivan principles. Can you tell us whether American companies operating there are working in the interest of or against the interest of the black Africans?
Let me say something about Leon Sullivan first, because I always like to say this before I answer that question. Leon Sullivan is a very dear friend of mine, and we work together on so many issues, and on this issue we have just an awfully fundamental disagreement. I think that corporations are just so tickled that Reverend Sullivan offered these principles because it's been a life raft for them. It's given them an excuse to stay in South Africa. So the better persons to ask this question would be South Africans themselves. As one told me in responding to what value the American corporate involvement had in South Africa, he said, "We don't want our shackles polished. We want them removed." So that one can say that there are some jobs offered to some black South Africans through the American investment. There are about 70,000 jobs we're talking about, but we're talking about 20 million people. That is more than offset in value when one thinks of what enormous assistance these corporations give to the government of South Africa. 70% of South Africa's computers are supplied by American companies, the other 30% by the British. If those computers were withdrawn, that government couldn't meet its payroll next week. It has no capacity to produce large frame computers. 44% of the oil brought in by our companies. High tech, the whole business. Major suppliers, the United States, West Germany, France, and Great Britain.
Thank you, Randall Robinson, for a provocative and challenging forum. The City Club is adjourned.